She never heard her mother's voice, but she felt her hands, rough with work, soft with her. The first memories were of texture, not sound. The thatched roof above her crib leaking slivers of pale morning light, the woven blanket that itched against her cheeks. The gentle, repetitive brushing of fingers along her hairline as her mother worked wool beside her. In that tiny cottage, life was stitched together from breath, wind, and motion. Her world began in the hush of things unspoken. She was born in a season of thin snow and smoke. The hearth coughed heat into the damp air, and the chickens often huddled at the doorway, uninvited guests hoping for scraps. Her mother hummed sometimes, lips vibrating with songs passed through generations, but the child only watched. She stared up, blinking, tracing the curve of lips without knowing melody or meaning. The coals whispered stories, the floorboards creaked lullabies, but none of it reached her. She slept in stillness, dreamless, wrapped in a quiet that was never broken. The others noticed slowly. Her father first suspected something when he dropped a copper pan and she didn't startle. The sound clanged like a storm in the small room, and he flinched harder than she did. Her eyes remained on the wooden doll in her lap, unfazed. Later, her mother would shout across the garden to call her home for supper, only to find the girl still crouched near the stream, following a line of ants with reverent fascination. Her ears never turned toward voices, only to wind and birds that stirred the air. But those, too, she only saw, never heard. They gave her time to grow, to prove herself wrong. Maybe she was slow, maybe stubborn. Maybe she would speak late, like a cousin once did. But as the seasons changed and the baby fat melted from her cheeks, as her legs grew stronger and her eyes more observant, one thing did not change. Silence clung to her like a second skin. She never flinched at thunder. She never cried when her father's voice rose. She laughed only when others laughed first, mimicking joy without knowing its reason. The neighbors began to murmur. "Perhaps she's cursed," they whispered, "touched by spirits or God's punishment." But the girl herself remained untouched by their fears. Her brother, only 3 years older, was the only one who treated her without question. He played with her in gestures, invented signs with their hands. 2 fingers tapping the chest meant home. A circling motion meant again. They built a secret language in shadows and gestures, a language spoken with fingertips and eyebrows and grins. While others spoke over her, around her, he looked directly at her, anchoring her to the world. He became her anchor. She watched everything. The curve of smoke from chimneys, the way sheep kicked their legs just before lying down, the flicker in a man's eyes before he lied. Without sound to distract her, the world arrived to her in layers, thicker, sharper, truer. She could sense tension before it ripened. She could read lips without understanding the words, intuiting meaning from the pace and pressure. Her world was made of patterns. patterns in the way her mother's fingers twitched before a storm, patterns in how people breathed when they were afraid. But she could not escape the loneliness of not being understood. She smiled often, broadly, openly, but it rarely landed. Villagers responded with tight expressions, uncomfortable chuckles, or averted eyes. Her joy became an unanswered letter. In the church, she watched the congregation rise and kneel as one, lips moving in unison, eyes pressed shut in invisible communion. She mimicked the motions, bowed when they bowed, folded hands when they did, but always with a delay. Always a beat behind, as though she existed in a parallel rhythm. There was one moment she carried for years, a night her father tried to teach her prayer. He knelt beside her and moved her hands into a clasp, guiding her to mimic his posture. He spoke slowly, clearly, enunciating every syllable, hoping she would speak them back. She watched, wide-eyed, mouth parted, waiting for something to make sense. But nothing did. When she did not respond, he shook her gently, frustration bleeding into his touch. She blinked, confused, and reached out to touch his beard, fascinated by the way his anger rearranged his face. He pushed her hand away. That night she did not sleep. The village tolerated her, but only just. The priest came once, placing a hand on her head and muttering a blessing. She stared up at him, watching his jaw move like an animal chewing. He gave her mother a look she couldn't interpret. That evening her mother wept quietly by the hearth, wiping her cheeks as though ashamed of water. Her father drank until the lanterns burned out. No one spoke of it again. As she aged, her silence became more visible. Other children learned chants and verses. She chased butterflies. They practiced hymns. She carved shapes into the dirt. She was always watching, always near, but never quite with them. They began calling her names: fool, ghost, dumb lamb. She didn't hear the words, but she saw their faces twist as they mouthed them. The meanings arrived in their sneers, not their syllables. One boy spat on her sleeve. She laughed, thinking he had sneezed, and offered him her cloth to wipe his nose. He stared, bewildered, then ran. Despite all this, she did not grow bitter. She continued to find beauty in the unnoticed. The moss that formed perfect rings around stones. The way raindrops clung to the edges of leaves like trembling stars. She would sit for hours tracing the veins in her hands, wondering if they meant anything, if the lines had stories etched in them like tree bark. The world to her was not made of noise, but of texture, weight, color, and breath. Her mother taught her what she could: how to knead bread, how to gut fish, how to spin wool with fingers and foot. The lessons were patient, physical, firm. They required no words, only demonstration. The girl learned fast, hands mimicking each action until muscle memory replaced instruction. She grew useful. Her silence became an asset in the early morning when animals spooked easily. She moved like a ghost through the barn, milking before the rooster crowed, collecting eggs before dawn scattered gold on the floor. And yet, with all she learned, the ache of being left out remained. Festivals were the worst. She would see their mouths open wide in cheer, songs she could never join, dances that required timing she did not possess. She would spin, yes, and twirl with joy, but always one step out of rhythm, the musician's cues lost to her. Once, during midsummer, a girl grabbed her hand and pulled her into the circle. She smiled, heart pounding, thinking for a moment she was chosen. But when the steps changed and she didn't, they laughed and let her go. She stood, blinking, not knowing the joke was her. Nights were the safest. The world calmed then. Language retreated into crackling fires and breath. She would lie in bed and watch shadows flicker on the walls, telling herself stories with her fingers. She had names for stars, not their real names, but her own. One was Mother's Breath, another Soft Cow, one she called Brother's Smile. She counted them, not in numbers, but in beats of her heart. That was the only rhythm she trusted. Once she tried to make sound. Alone in the barn, she opened her mouth and pushed her breath forward. Nothing came but a rasp. She tried again, harder, and it turned into a croak. She kept trying, each attempt scraping her throat. Her face burned with effort. Eventually, she stopped, throat raw, eyes stinging. She never tried again. Whatever sound was, it did not belong to her. Still, she never stopped imagining. She imagined what her mother's voice might sound like. Would it be soft like wool, or sharp like a hawk's cry? Did her brother sing? What did a river sound like when it rushed over stones? Did people's voices carry colors? Was laughter different from shouting, or did they feel the same? She watched people speak with the same reverence others reserved for fire or bread. It was sacred, this thing she could not touch. Time passed as it does in small villages, slowly like honey settling in a jar. She grew taller, leaner, her face sharper. She began to notice the worry in her mother's eyes, the tightness in her father's jaw. Her brother no longer played as often. Work pressed on them all, yet the girl remained tethered to a world slightly out of sync, always beside, never quite inside. One afternoon, she found a bird with a broken wing. It flapped wildly when she approached, but couldn't lift itself. She knelt, cradled it gently, and wrapped it in her shawl. At home, she made a small nest near the hearth, fed it crumbs, and waited. Each day, she checked its wing. One morning, it was gone. Her mother said the cat took it. But she imagined it flying free, brushing the sky with its healed wings. In her heart, that bird lived. It became a symbol of something she could not name, a longing, a promise, maybe even a prayer. Not one spoken, but one felt in the bones. And in that silence, her story began. They didn't speak to her. They spoke about her, mouths curling like dogs, hands drawing symbols she would never know. The girl often walked into rooms already humming with suspicion, the kind that silenced itself only in her presence. When her back was turned, their whispers returned like wind through the cracks of the cottage, colder than the frost outside. She knew this rhythm now, the beat of being watched, the eyes that looked without looking. By her 7th year, the village had learned to fear what it did not understand, and she had learned to feel fear without ever hearing it. They did not shout at her. They didn't need to. A look, a gesture, the sudden pulling away of a hand that once held hers. These became louder than any voice ever could. She would walk past the smithy and see the apprentice pause his hammer, stare, and mutter something to the blackened air. In the bakery, the woman would stop kneading dough mid-motion to cross herself when the girl entered, as though she brought with her a shadow that clung to flour and fire. Her brother tried to shield her from it. When the children threw stones, it was he who stepped in front of her, arms wide, shouting. She couldn't hear his words, but she saw the fierceness in his posture, the sharp flash of his teeth as he growled back at them. She felt his trembling afterward, the way his shoulders quivered beneath her hand. They would run into the woods, and only there would he let the tears fall, not for himself, but for her. She never cried then. She only sat beside him, pressing their palms together until the tremors stilled. But the stares returned. Every morning, every evening, every time her feet touched the village paths, she felt them. Mothers pulling children closer. Boys throwing dirt near her feet to watch her not react. Once a girl smeared pig's blood on the door of their cottage, a silent curse in red. Her father cleaned it without a word, his face hard as stone, and for 3 nights he didn't speak to anyone, not out of anger but something deeper. Shame, perhaps, or fear that the village might be right. The priest came again, this time not with a blessing but a warning. He stood at the threshold, robe heavy with rain, lips thin and pressed like seams. He did not enter. He simply looked at the girl, then at her mother, and said slowly, "The devil prefers silence." Her mother's face went pale. The priest turned and left. No scripture, no comfort, just those words. From then on, her mother began to pray more, louder, as though volume might ward off evil. Still, the girl worked. She woke before dawn, fed the chickens, milked the goat, carried water from the stream. Her hands became calloused, her arms strong. She chopped wood until the axe felt like an extension of her spine, its weight familiar, its rhythm her own. She learned when the bread dough was ready not by timers or instructions, but by feel. The stretch beneath her knuckles, the sigh of the yeast. She grew into her tasks like vines around old stone, quietly, persistently. But she remained an odd rhythm in a village that valued harmony above all. Here, everyone marched to the bell's toll, to the priest's word, to the seasons measured by saints' days. But she moved outside of time, outside of sound. And because of this, she became a threat. Not by action, but by existence. Her difference was a crack in the wall, and the village feared what might seep through. Children mimicked her behind her back. They flailed their arms, rolled their eyes, mocked her silence with cruel theatrics. She watched once as a group of boys pantomimed a dance, pretending to fall into fits the moment she passed. She didn't understand the joke, but she understood the laughter. Her brother tried to stop them, but even he couldn't be everywhere. Sometimes she found herself alone in the fields, watching clouds move like drifting thoughts, wondering if they too were laughed at for their silence. She began to avoid the market, sending her brother in her place. Even her mother didn't insist. It was easier that way, easier not to see the baker turn his back, the butcher mutter a prayer under his breath. Easier not to see the way people stepped around her as if she were something spilled on the ground. In return, she withdrew deeper into her inner world. She built stories from shadows and shapes. A fallen branch became a wandering knight. A trail of feathers foretold a message. In silence, she found magic. But the village found madness. They said she watched too closely, that her eyes didn't blink enough. They said she wandered the woods at night, consorted with spirits, danced without music. Once, a woman swore she saw the girl talking to a tree. Another claimed the livestock grew anxious when she passed. Each story built on the last, and together they became gospel. Her father, weary and weathered, said little. He worked longer hours in the field, his back bent like the old cart he pulled. When he returned, his silence met hers like two ghosts nodding across a room. He never called her cursed, but neither did he call her anything at all. Her mother tried to braid her hair each morning, tried to teach her to sew, tried to mouth prayers she could follow. But even love has limits when pressed by fear, and fear pressed hard. Only her brother stayed unchanged. He brought her trinkets from the market, a button carved from bone, a cloth dyed with beetroot, once even a tiny bell she could not hear but wore anyway, tucked in her pocket like a talisman. He told her stories, slowly, using the signs they invented. She understood only pieces, but the rhythm of his hands comforted her more than any sound ever could. Once she followed a wounded fox into the woods, hoping to help. She returned with a gash across her arm, blood soaking her sleeve. Her mother screamed, but the girl didn't flinch. She only looked down at the wound, puzzled. Later, the healer stitched it closed with trembling fingers, whispering, "She didn't cry. She didn't even whimper. That's not natural." The next day, someone left a dead crow on their doorstep. Her brother buried it while she watched the sky. She learned not to meet their eyes. She kept her head down, her steps light. She avoided the well at noon when the women gathered. She avoided the churchyard, the corners of the market where boys loitered. The path she walked each day became narrower, bordered not by trees or fences, but by the sharp outlines of judgment. The village festivals grew louder each year, as though trying to drown out what they feared. The fires burned higher, the music thudded deeper, the priest's sermons stretched longer. She watched from afar, her face lit by torchlight, never invited, never missed. And still she smiled, quietly, gently, as though she didn't know better, or perhaps because she did. One winter, the snow came late, and with it a sickness. Children coughed blood. Old men didn't wake, and the baker's wife lost her second child in as many years. The village grew afraid again. This time, their fear had weight. They looked for causes, for sins unrepented, for eyes too wide and too silent. They began to stare at her not with pity or cruelty, but with calculation. She felt the shift like a change in wind. The way people stopped speaking when she passed, not out of scorn but strategy, as though words might tie them to her, as though proximity might invite something worse than shame. She became a cautionary tale, walking among them in real time. One morning she found a small wooden doll outside their door, its mouth cut open, its ears scratched out. Her mother snatched it away, burned it without a word. That night the girl dreamt of eyes, dozens of them, floating in the dark, watching, always watching. She woke to find her brother sitting beside her bed, candle flickering, hand resting on hers. He began teaching her more signs, more precise, more expressive. She learned how to say danger, stay, run, safe. He mimed storms and sickness, hunger and hope. They practiced in the barn, surrounded by hay and shadows where no one could interrupt. Her hands became a second language, one she wielded with elegance. But it wasn't enough to bridge the space between her and the village. The priest visited again. He brought holy water, sprinkled it on the doorframe, said her name aloud. She didn't hear it, but she saw his mouth form it, strange, deliberate, like someone tasting something bitter. He told her mother it might be time. Time to send the girl away to a convent perhaps, or somewhere quieter. For her own soul, he said. Her mother didn't answer. But that night the fire burned hotter, and her mother sat staring into it long after the others slept. Even the animals sensed it. The hens scattered when she entered the coop. The dog, once friendly, now growled low and constant. The goat refused her hand. Only the cat remained, curling around her ankles, purring against her silence. She began speaking to it with signs, pretending it understood. It blinked slowly, and that was enough. She began to spend more time in the woods, where trees didn't judge and wind didn't whisper rumors. There she walked barefoot, let leaves press against her skin, let streams run over her feet. She sang, not with sound but with motion, arms sweeping, fingers dancing. She wrote stories in mud, drew faces on bark, built shrines of moss and stone. She created a world that needed no explanation. But the village still watched. From behind curtains, over fences, through the corners of their prayers. She was the note that didn't belong in their song, the color outside their tapestry. They didn't understand her, and so they feared her. And so they waited for her to change, to break, to leave. And she waited too. Not for them, but for something else. Something she couldn't name. Not redemption, not escape, something quieter. Something that might arrive in the stillness between the heartbeat of trees. Until then, she remained, walking among them like a shadow cast in daylight, present, persistent, and uninvited. In the woods, nothing mocked her. Nothing waited for her to answer. The trees did not flinch when she approached. The moss did not whisper behind her back. There were no sideways glances, no muttered names or symbols traced in fear. Only light shifting. Only leaves trembling. And in that, she found something she hadn't known she was missing: welcome. She began her wanderings without purpose, drawn by instinct rather than defiance. At first, she ventured just beyond the village's reach, where the soil turned soft and the thorns thinned. A place where the wind had room to roam and the sky scattered in pieces through trembling branches. She would walk slowly, barefoot when she could, letting twigs snap gently beneath her soles, feeling the stories the ground had to offer. Here, the world was not built on sound but on sensation. The language of the forest spoke in a tongue she could understand. She learned its cadence, how the pine needles whispered in a different rhythm than the oak leaves, how the dampness beneath a log meant recent rain, and how spider webs, stretched wide and glistening, marked an untouched path. She began to memorize the sun's journey through the canopy, how it stitched patterns on the ground, how it danced across bark like breath. Each day the forest grew less foreign and more like a forgotten room in a familiar home. She didn't ask permission to be there. The forest did not require it. It simply received her, quiet, steady, eternal, and so she walked longer, farther, sometimes until the village disappeared completely behind trunks and fog. In those deeper parts the silence thickened, not like the stillness of judgment but like the stillness of being known. There the quiet wasn't empty, it was full. And then one day, without plan or prophecy, she saw her. The woman was crouched near a ring of mushrooms, her hands brushing the earth as if greeting an old friend. She wore layers of tattered wool and bark-colored linen. Her hair was a wild net of gray, caught with feathers, bits of twine, even a dried sprig of rosemary. Her back was bent with time, but her movements were precise, graceful. She did not notice the girl at first, or perhaps she did, and simply chose not to show it. The girl froze behind a veil of leaves, watching. The old woman traced the air with her fingers, muttering without voice. Her lips moved, but no sound came. She plucked a mushroom, placed it in a pouch, then stood slowly, her gaze drifting up and finding the girl. They stared at each other for a long breath. Neither smiled. Neither moved. The girl waited for the recoil, the accusation, the sign to flee. But the woman only nodded, a gesture more weighty than welcome. Then she turned and vanished into the trees as if she had never been. The girl returned to that place the next day, and the day after. Each time the woman appeared, never waiting, never guiding, just existing nearby, doing her strange, quiet work, gathering roots, sketching circles in the dirt, speaking to plants with her hands. She never spoke a word, not to the girl, not to the forest, not to herself, but her presence was a kind of language, and the girl understood. At first she kept her distance. She sat against trees and watched the woman mix herbs, place stones in deliberate patterns, or smear ash on bark. The girl would mimic her motions when alone, pressing leaves together, trying to remember which plants the woman kept and which she discarded. Slowly, she began to approach. She brought things: sticks shaped like arrows, feathers with unusual colors, once even a broken bird's egg with a perfect blue shell. The woman accepted each gift without comment, placing them in her bag or arranging them in the dirt. One day, the girl mimed a question, pressing her hands together and raising her eyebrows. The woman responded by pointing to the moss and then to the sky. It wasn't an answer, but it wasn't silence either. A new language was born that day, not built from grammar or names, but from gestures, glances, shared space. In time, the woman let her help. She showed her how to peel bark without scarring the tree, how to dry herbs on flat stones warmed by the sun, how to mash roots into paste, smear them over wounds, cover them with soft leaves. She taught her how to read the veins in plants, how to identify poison by smell, how to crush berries without staining the fingers if they were safe. There was no ceremony, no declaration of mentorship. It simply became. They moved together through the woods like twin shadows, one old, one young, both silent, both unseen by the village that had turned its back. They did not smile often, but when they did, it was like light breaking through fog, brief but enough. The girl's hands changed. They no longer shook when she worked. Her movements grew sure, fluid. Her eyes learned to look deeper. Where once she saw only color and form, now she saw stories, leaves curling before rain, bark splitting before spring. She no longer followed the forest, she moved with it. Sometimes they would sit without doing. Just sit, legs crossed, backs against trunks, eyes following a bird, a squirrel, the drift of mist through branches. Those moments became her favorite. In the village, silence was a burden. Here it was a bond. She began carving again, this time not in dirt but in wood. Small totems, symbols she didn't name. She'd leave them at the base of trees, press them into knots in bark, bury them under moss. She wasn't sure why. It felt right. Perhaps it was her way of speaking back to the forest, of saying thank you. The woman never asked about the village, never hinted at knowing, but she must have. Perhaps she too had been watched once, weighed and found wanting. Perhaps that was why she lived here in the green hush with only the trees to keep her company. The girl never asked. She didn't need to. Some stories didn't require retelling. One day they came upon a dying deer, its leg twisted, its breath shallow. The woman knelt beside it, placed a hand over its eyes, whispered something the girl could not hear. Then she took a knife from her belt and ended its pain. The girl flinched, but didn't turn away. The woman placed a palm against the deer's chest, waited, then stood. She plucked a tuft of fur, handed it to the girl, and turned without a word. That night, the girl braided the fur into a cord and wore it around her wrist. Seasons shifted quietly. The forest wore different skins, green and gold, then silver and bare. The girl learned each version of it like pages in a book. She knew where the mushrooms first appeared after rain, where the fox dens hid, where the crows gathered at dusk. She moved with care, not fear. The village faded from her thoughts like a dream after waking. Even her brother became a distant ache, a warm ache but dulled. And yet she was not gone from him. Sometimes he would find things tucked into the corners of his path, a carved piece of bark, a feather bound in string, a stone marked with soot. He would gather them in silence, press them to his chest, and say nothing. He knew where she had gone. He knew better than to follow, but he never stopped looking to the trees when he passed. The girl began marking time in other ways, not with bells or candles, but with growth. How far the vines climbed each month, when the birds returned, when the woman's hands began to shake more than usual. It happened slowly, tremors in her fingers, slower steps, longer silences. One day the woman sat for a long time beneath a birch and did not rise. The girl waited, brought her water, crushed herbs for her knees, but something in the woman had begun to quiet even further. Still they worked. Still they walked. The woman showed her how to brew tinctures, how to store roots through winter, how to bind herbs for hanging. Her teachings became faster, more urgent, as though passing a flame before it burned out. The girl absorbed everything, memorized each motion, each combination. She did not need words. She needed only presence. On the first frost of the new winter, the woman placed a bundle in her hands, a satchel made of reed and hide, filled with dried herbs, carved tools, pressed flowers wrapped in cloth. She pressed the girl's fingers around it, nodded once, then closed her eyes. She did not die that night. Not yet. But she said goodbye in that way the forest taught, with gesture, not voice. After that, they sat more than they walked. The girl prepared the food, tended the fire, made teas the woman had once brewed. They sat, hands folded, eyes soft, surrounded by trees that had watched them both change. When the woman passed, it was without struggle. One morning, she simply didn't wake. The girl waited a long time before touching her hand. It was cold, but not frightening. She gathered pine branches, wildflowers, the softest moss, and wrapped the body in silence. She buried her beneath the roots of the oldest tree they had visited, carving a circle in the bark above. She did not cry. But for days after, the forest felt different. The wind seemed to pause more often. The light fell heavier. The girl wandered with slower steps, listening for a voice that had never been spoken aloud. And then, one evening, as dusk settled like breath across the forest floor, a fox crossed her path. It stopped, looked at her, and didn't run. She stared back, and something in her shifted. She stood taller. The satchel was still at her side. The path behind her was faint but clear. The village might still whisper, still fear. But the forest had spoken, and she had listened. Now she could speak back. She saw the change before she understood it. Mouths moved faster, hands pointed more. Doors slammed, shutters closed. Faces wore panic like mud, smudged, unavoidable. The rhythm of the village, once slow and resentful, now pulsed with frantic urgency. The bells tolled, again and again, but to her, they were only heavy things swinging above rooftops. She didn't know that their sound was grief. To her, it was just another day. She returned from the forest carrying bundles of yarrow and thyme, small green offerings for the satchel still tied around her waist. The frost had begun to edge the grass again, delicate and white, the kind that crunched underfoot and made her smile. But the village didn't smile. It watched her, tighter, quieter. Windows opened only wide enough for eyes. Doors opened only long enough for people to slip through like shadows. She walked through it like a bird through still air, unaware of the net tightening around her. She didn't see the sickness at first, not clearly. A child sat slumped against a stoop, face pale. A man coughed into his cloak and stumbled toward the church. But she had seen weariness before. The seasons turned people thin. Hunger made them gaunt. Grief bent their backs. This, she thought, was no different. And yet the spaces between people widened. The markets emptied. No songs drifted from the tavern. No children chased chickens in the dust. Silence now ruled not just her, but everyone. Her mother no longer braided her hair. She knelt for longer, her hands pressed hard together, her face turned to the sky as if bargaining with something far above. Her lips moved in desperate rhythms. The girl watched the tears fall but did not know their cause. She sat beside her, placed a hand on her shoulder. Her mother flinched. Her brother came home early one day, shoulders hunched. His cheeks were flushed with heat. He smiled, but it faltered, trembling at the corners. He touched her hand, squeezed it, then turned away quickly as if afraid to stay close too long. That night, she found his bed empty and then found him in the barn, coughing into his sleeve. She moved to touch him, but he backed away. He smiled again, wide, too wide, and shook his head. She didn't understand. His hands didn't explain. His eyes said everything. Later, he drew symbols in the dust between them. A circle, a jagged line, a small cross. His hands moved slowly. She tried to mimic the shape of the words with her own signs, but they didn't match. He held her hand, pressed it to his chest and then to his mouth. Then he coughed again and red bloomed on the straw. She stared at it, bright, unnatural, and reached for him. He pushed her hand away. She stayed by him until dawn. He slept fitfully. She placed cool cloths on his forehead, poured teas between his lips, stroked his hair. He didn't open his eyes again that day. The next morning she saw the cart. It moved slowly, wheels groaning, pulled by a man with a scarf over his face. In it lay bodies, some wrapped in cloth, some not, eyes open, mouths slack. She stood at the corner of the lane and watched it pass. The man didn't meet her gaze. He rang a bell in his hand, softly, steadily, but to her it was nothing, just motion, just a blur of silver swinging through air. She returned to the cottage and found her mother collapsed beside the hearth. Her prayers had dissolved into sobs, loud, racking, wordless cries. The girl knelt, unsure what to do. Her mother gripped her wrist tightly, painfully, and mouthed words with cracked lips. The girl searched her face for meaning, found only terror. She pulled back, stood, turned, unsure where to go. The sickness had no sound, but it moved like thunder. The village no longer watched her. It no longer had the strength. People barricaded themselves inside. Those who had once cursed her now stumbled past, faces gray, eyes distant. The priest stood outside the church, holding a book aloft and shouting into the wind. She saw the veins in his neck, the strain of his jaw. She did not know what he said, but his fear was loud. She wandered, untouched. People recoiled when she passed, but not out of hatred now, out of fear. They stepped away, drew symbols in the air, muttered things they thought might protect them. But she walked among them like a spirit, calm, silent, immune not just to sound, but to hysteria. They did not know what to make of her. She returned to the forest, hoping to find the woman, but she did not appear. The clearings were empty, the stones unmoved. Only wind greeted her, and the trees unmoved in their indifference. She sat at the base of their old birch, tracing its bark with her fingers. The forest did not whisper answers. Each day the bells tolled. She did not hear them. Each day the cart returned. She saw the bodies change. Some she recognized, a boy who once spat at her, the baker's daughter, the old woman with the limp. They were all still now. Whatever they had once said, they said no longer. She tried to help. She knocked on doors, brought herbs wrapped in cloth, placed bowls of water beside steps. Few opened. One woman screamed when she saw her, slammed the door in her face. A child cried and hid behind a wall. She stood there for a long time, basket in hand, unsure what kindness was supposed to look like when no one wanted it. One night, her mother's breathing changed. It was shallow, sharp. Her lips trembled, her skin damp. The girl sat beside her, brushing her hair back, holding her hand. Her mother gripped her fingers hard, gasped a word that never made it into meaning. The girl tried to brew tea, tried to lift her head, tried to make sense of the shapes her mother's mouth made, but none of it helped. She watched as the color drained from her face. When the sun rose, her mother's chest no longer moved. The girl sat still for hours, her hands in her lap, her eyes unfocused. She did not cry. She lit a candle, placed it at her mother's feet, and began to clean the room. She brushed her hair, washed her hands, folded her shawl. She covered her body with the blanket from her bed, the one she had used as a child. Then she sat beside her and watched the flame flicker. That evening she dug. The ground was cold, hard, but she did not stop. She worked until her nails split, until her hands were red and raw. She dug until the earth softened, then lined the bottom with pine branches. She wrapped her mother's body in linen, kissed her forehead, and placed her gently into the grave. She sang as she covered the earth, not with voice but with hands. A song of motion, a rhythm only she could hear. After that, the world grew quieter still. Her brother's bed remained empty. She checked it each day, hoping. Once she found a sprig of lavender left on the pillow. She didn't know what it meant. She tucked it into her satchel. The village was broken now. No carts came, no bells tolled. The priest vanished. People disappeared into their homes and never came out. Smoke no longer rose from chimneys. The path to the well was overgrown. Chickens roamed free. Dogs barked at nothing. And still she moved calm, untouched. She carried water, tended the fire, left food on doorsteps. Sometimes the offerings disappeared. Sometimes they remained. She left them anyway. One morning she found a girl sitting on the road crying into her knees. The girl had lost her parents. She didn't speak. She only sobbed. The deaf girl sat beside her, gently touched her back. The child turned, startled, but did not run. She placed her small hand into hers. They sat together until the sun rose higher. Then they stood and walked together to the stream. Others came. A boy with a burn on his hand, a woman with empty eyes, a man too thin to stand. She did not speak. She only helped, cleaning wounds, brewing teas, placing cool cloths on foreheads. She worked in silence, moved in silence, and somehow that silence became safety. They stopped recoiling. They began watching again, but with something new, not fear, not suspicion, hope. They did not understand her, but they no longer needed to. They built a fire together. They boiled water. They shared food. They buried the dead. She led without lading. They followed without asking. In her stillness they found peace. The village did not return to what it was. It could not. Too many gone. Too many memories scorched. But something else began. Small, uncertain. Each morning she rose before the others. She walked to the edge of the forest, stood beneath the birch and waited. Not for the old woman, not for answers, just for the moment to begin. She stood in silence, and the forest once again spoke without words. And this time she knew exactly what it meant. She didn't hear the crowd, but she saw the fire bloom like an angry flower. It began at the edge of the village where light shouldn't burn at dusk. A strange flicker in the distance, red cutting through gray. She stood in the doorway of the cottage, hands still damp from washing the day's harvest, and watched as shadows began to move strangely, jerking, wide, flailing. The smoke came first, crawling over rooftops in thin ribbons. Then the light followed, torches, dozens of them. Unnatural, frenzied. She tilted her head, confused. Why were they moving toward her? She stepped outside, squinting against the dusk. They came not like villagers, but like a storm, scattered, howling, united only by fear. She could not hear their voices, but she saw mouths twisted, arms raised. Some pointed at her. Others lifted torches high, letting the wind whip the flames. Their feet stamped the ground like a drumbeat she could feel in her ribs. Still, she did not move. She had lived her whole life outside of sound, but she knew the shape of fear. She had felt it pass through the air like a shiver, tasted it in the way people pulled away. But this was new. This was heat. It moved like judgment. She turned and fled barefoot through the frost-hardened path, the satchel bouncing at her hip. Behind her, the noise grew louder, not in volume but in presence. She could feel it pressing, swelling, hunting. The cottage faded into darkness. The smoke followed. She didn't understand why. The plague had quieted. The dead were buried. Fires had been lit. Bread had returned to ovens. And yet fear had not died. It had changed. It had turned, and it had remembered her. They said she never cried at the funerals. They said she never bowed her head during prayer. She walked among the sick and never flinched. She didn't speak. She didn't scream. Her silence was no longer mysterious. It was monstrous. Someone said she brought it. Someone else said she brewed something in the woods, mixed it with herbs, whispered curses into the roots of trees. Someone remembered the dead crow left long ago on her doorstep. Someone remembered the symbols she carved into bark. Someone remembered the way their child didn't wake after receiving her medicine. Someone remembered too much and understood nothing. The village had found a shape to its pain, and that shape was her. She didn't make it far. The path to the forest was longer in panic. The night bent strangely, trees seeming farther than before, the woods folding in on themselves. Branches clawed at her arms. Her foot caught in a root, sending her sprawling. She rose quickly, bleeding from her palm, and stumbled forward. Then she saw it. A shape in the shadows, still familiar. The old woman. She stepped forward from behind the bramble as if emerging from the earth itself. Her eyes narrowed, her hands raised. The girl ran to her. No words were exchanged. They never were. The woman grasped her wrist, pulled her into the trees, away from the path, deeper into undergrowth no villager would dare follow. They moved like ghosts. The woman's hands moved fast, clearing branches, covering tracks, signaling for silence, though no sound had been made. They reached a hollow in the earth, part cave, part root shelter. The woman pushed her inside, then crouched at the entrance, drawing symbols into the dirt, covering it with leaves, moss, earth. She didn't explain. She didn't have to. The girl sat still inside, knees to her chest, listening to the sound of her own breath. Smoke began to rise into the trees. The village had reached her cottage. Flames clawed into the sky. Sparks flew like frantic insects. The fire spread quickly, faster than she'd ever seen. Faster than fire should. Rage had fed it. She could see it through the cracks in the trees, her home glowing red, trembling under heat. She didn't cry. She couldn't. Her throat felt made of stone. Her hands curled into fists in her lap. The fire she couldn't hear now lit the sky above her. It wasn't just her cottage. The flames caught the stable, then the shed, then the trees at the edge of the garden. The wind pulled it onward, outward. The village wasn't trying to punish her. It was trying to erase her. The woman returned at nightfall. Her face was covered in soot. She placed food in the girl's lap: roots, dried apples, bitter tea in a leather flask. She didn't sit. She stood at the entrance, watching the dark beyond, hand resting on a gnarled staff. Her silence was louder than any warning. For 2 days they hid. The girl didn't speak. She barely moved. She watched her fingers trace lines in the earth, her thoughts flickering like leaves. She tried to remember the words her brother taught her: safe, stay, danger. She whispered them to her own hands. It helped, not much, but enough. On the 3rd day she left the shelter. The woman tried to stop her, grabbing her arm, shaking her head. But the girl only touched her wrist gently, smiled, and stepped away. She walked slowly. She didn't look back. The village was gray. The fire had taken half the cottages. Her own home was ash, barely outlined. The well was black with soot. The church doors were gone. The air still smelled of smoke. No one moved. The villagers remained inside, behind shuttered windows, behind whatever courage they had left. She walked the main path barefoot, her feet blackened, her clothes damp with earth. She made no sound, but they saw her. Faces appeared in slits between boards, eyes wide, mouths shut. No one called out, no one threw stones. No one raised a hand. She passed the priest's house. Its door was broken, the cross above it half burned. She passed the baker's stall, collapsed. She passed the square where they once danced during festivals, where she was never invited. She stopped there. She stood still in the center, letting them see her, letting them remember what they'd done. Then quietly she knelt. She placed her satchel on the ground, opened it, removed 3 bundles, one of herbs, one of twine, one of carved bone. She set them carefully on the stones. Then she stood and walked away. She did not run. She did not hide. She walked through the village as if it were any other morning, as if the world had not turned, as if her skin was not blistered, her lungs not scorched. No one followed her. She reached the forest's edge and paused, turned and saw a child step out from behind a wall, a girl, small, barefoot, eyes wet. The girl ran forward toward her. Her mother screamed from inside, but too late. The child reached the deaf girl and held out something in her hand, a single sprig of lavender. The deaf girl took it, nodded once, and turned toward the trees. The child stood alone, watching. And slowly, one by one, more villagers emerged. They didn't come close. They didn't speak. They simply stood, holding bowls, scraps of cloth, small offerings, an apology without words. She did not return to them. She disappeared into the forest where no crowd could burn her, no bell could blame her. The woods closed around her like a book being shut, and the fire, once so eager to consume, now flickered and faded behind her. She had survived what others could not just the plague, but the fear. And the fear had burned itself out. The river didn't care who she was. It didn't know her name. It didn't whisper about her in the dark or trace symbols on doorsteps. It only flowed, steady, endless, without memory. And now she floated with it. She stumbled through the trees, wrapped in smoke-stained cloth, her skin bruised, her feet torn open by the forest floor. Her hair clung to her face in ropes. Her breath was shallow, sharp. But still, she moved forward, guided not by a path but by the distant glimmer of water and the way her lungs ached for something clean. The river found her before she found it. A bend in the land opened, revealing its silver spine winding through the valley like a long exhale. She reached it as twilight fell, collapsing at the bank, letting her body sink into the mud. For a long time she didn't move. She simply lay there, eyes closed, face against the cold earth, listening not with ears but with skin. The hum of the river vibrated against her cheek. Not sound, just motion. When she finally sat up, night had taken the sky. The stars blinked above her like distant fires. She cupped water in her palms and drank. It tasted of stone and rain. She drank again. Then she dipped her arms in, scrubbing away the soot, the dried blood, the memory. The cold bit into her bones, but she welcomed it. Pain, after all, was one of the few languages she still understood. She followed the bank until she found the mill. It was broken, abandoned, long forgotten. A slanted building with a half-collapsed roof and a wheel that no longer turned. Moss crawled up its stones. Ivy clung to its frame like time refusing to let go. But the walls stood, and the door, though warped, opened. Inside, the air was dry. Dust hung in the beams like memory. Old tools rested where hands had left them generations ago. Mice scattered when she stepped inside. She stood in the silence, breathing slowly, letting the space wrap around her like a shawl. This, she decided, would be enough. She gathered wood, dried leaves, anything that would burn. She built a fire in the hearth with trembling hands. The first flame struggled, flickered, nearly died. Then it caught. It crackled to life, throwing light across the floor. She sat before it, legs curled under her, and let its warmth thaw what the river could not. For days she didn't leave the mill. She slept curled on a straw mat, wrapped in salvaged fabric. She bathed in the river each morning, wincing at the cold. She boiled roots in water and drank the bitter tea. Hunger came like an old enemy, familiar, sharp, insistent. She chewed bark. She crushed herbs. She fished with bare hands. She ate what the forest allowed. No one came. The silence here was different, not cruel, not loud with judgment. It was wide, forgiving. She filled it with motion, sorting leaves, weaving grass into cord, repairing a broken shutter. Her hands stayed busy so her mind would not unravel. Sometimes she carved. She found a piece of driftwood along the riverbank, soft and pale. With the blade she had carried since the forest days, she began etching symbols, shapes the old woman had once drawn in dirt, loops and lines that meant nothing and everything. She pressed hard, not to mark the wood, but to hear herself in a language no one else knew. She carved her story into it. One stroke for the boy who threw stones, one for the cottage that burned, one for the mother's hands pressed in prayer. She carved until her fingers ached. Each night she placed the wood beside her and touched the carvings as she fell asleep, like counting the stars. Time stopped behaving like time. The days were measured in light and ache, in how many fish the river gave, how many herbs she could dry. She stopped thinking in names. The village became a blur, its faces faded. Even her brother's smile, once vivid, now flickered like a dying candle. She didn't forget, she just stopped remembering on purpose. She spoke to the river, not with sound, of course. She moved her hands, drew shapes in the air, let her fingers dance with invisible words. She told it what she feared. She told it what she missed. She thanked it for listening. The river never answered, but it never left. One morning, while foraging near the bank, she found a bird tangled in reeds, its wing bent at an angle that made her chest tighten. It flailed weakly, one eye watching her. Carefully, she approached, cupped it in her hands. It didn't struggle. She wrapped it in her shawl and carried it back to the mill. She fed it bits of crushed worm and water from her fingers. She cleaned its wing with herbs, bound it with soft bark and twine. For days she tended it, whispering with her hands, letting it perch on her wrist. It never sang. She didn't mind. When the bird finally flew, it circled the mill once, then vanished into the trees. She stood at the window long after, watching the sky where it disappeared. That night, she carved a new symbol. Winter came like a shadow, slow, creeping, relentless. The wind howled through cracks in the stone. The river froze at the edges. She gathered extra firewood, wrapped herself in layers, slept close to the embers. She boiled everything, roots, bark, even moss, just to keep her stomach quiet. But the mill held. She began marking the wall beside her bed, one scratch for each day. When she forgot to scratch, she carved a deeper line the next. The wall became a story of survival, one line at a time. She traced it with her finger every morning, remembering the days she almost gave up, the nights she thought the silence would swallow her. Sometimes she dreamt of the village, not as it was, but as it could have been. Doors left open, fires burning for warmth, not destruction. A hand extended, not withdrawn. She dreamt of her mother's voice, though she had never heard it. Of her brother calling her name, though she did not know what it sounded like. She woke with her hands outstretched toward nothing. The loneliness was different now. Not sharp, not screaming, just a slow ache, like a bruise that never quite faded. It lived in her chest, but it did not crush her. It reminded her she was still alive. One day the river rose. Heavy rain swelled its belly. The bank disappeared beneath rushing water. She stood at the edge, watching it churn, foam, crash. It screamed without sound, and still she stood. She did not move until it calmed. She knew then that she was part of it now, not just someone who drank from it or bathed in it. It knew her. It held her story. She began building again, not for a village, not for company, but for shape. She built shelves from fallen limbs, baskets from reeds. She repaired the roof with branches and mud. She hung herbs from the rafters. She made a place for each carving, lining them along the wall like a silent choir. They became her voice, her memory, her proof. Sometimes she laughed, though it made no sound. A flutter in her chest, a twitch of her fingers, a widening of her eyes. The fire would crackle and she'd smile into it, remembering something no one else knew. She wrote stories in symbols, etched them on stone, on bark, even her own skin. Tiny shapes behind her ear, at the base of her spine. She was becoming her own language. And one day, as the thaw began and the birds returned, she found something on the riverbank. A bundle, wrapped in cloth, small, careful. Inside, dried berries, a carved wooden spoon, a length of wool string, and a note. She could not read it. But the handwriting was familiar. She held it to her chest and sat on the ground. She didn't move for a long time. That evening she carved a new symbol into the doorframe, this one open, unfinished, waiting. And the river kept flowing, carrying her story forward. The years passed without asking permission. Seasons came and folded themselves over the land like layers of cloth. The river continued to flow, weaving through ice and thaw and rain. The woman in the mill lived not in months or years, but in rhythms. The swell of spring herbs, the weight of summer heat, the stillness of autumn smoke, the sharp hush of snow. She marked time by the stories she carved into wood. There were many now. Symbols lined the beams, the shelves, the stones around the hearth. A language of curves and cuts, loops and lines, etched by memory and shaped by need. She no longer carved to remember pain. Now she carved to make sense of joy. She had survived not only the fire, but the silence after it. She was no longer the girl who had once waited for a village to see her. She no longer wanted them to. Her eyes had softened, but her hands had grown stronger. She carried water without strain. She built fences that held against wind. She had become her own world. The mill had become more than refuge. It was home. Her breath filled its corners. Her touch had mended its wounds. It was her voice in stone and wood. Then, one morning, something changed. She was gathering water from the river, her feet sunk ankle deep in the soft earth, when she noticed movement on the opposite bank. A figure, small, hesitant, wrapped in a tattered cloak. A child. The woman straightened, alert but still. The child watched her with wide eyes, no fear but a question. She raised one hand in greeting. The child did not respond. Instead, they stepped forward, slowly, bare feet pressing into mud. The woman did not move. The river whispered between them. The child crossed it. They were thin, dirty, a smudge of ash along one cheek. Their hair clung to their neck like seaweed. But it was their silence that struck the woman most. Not just lack of words. A familiar quiet, not the pause of shyness or the weight of trauma, but a deep silence born from absence. The child opened their mouth, shaped something, but no sound came. And the woman knew. She knelt slowly, gently placing her hands where the child could see them. She signed something simple. Hello. The child blinked. Then tentatively they raised their hands. Their fingers moved clumsy, uncertain, but purposeful. Hello. The woman's breath caught in her throat, not from shock, from recognition, For the first time in her life, someone looked at her hands and answered. She led the child to the mill, fed them warm broth made from river herbs, gave them her softest blanket, sat beside them by the fire. She didn't ask questions. She didn't need to. The child spoke without sound. Their eyes told stories of places walked, dangers passed, days without shelter. The woman only nodded, touched their wrist gently, signed safe. That night, the child slept without dreams. The woman did not sleep. She carved. The next day they spoke again with hands, slow at first, repeated gestures, shared meanings. A leaf meant more than leaf. It meant morning, freshness, the start of something. Fire wasn't just warmth. It was memory, loss, comfort, danger, light. The child watched closely, fingers mimicking shapes, eyes wide with wonder. They added their own signs, ones the woman hadn't seen. Symbols for fear, for hunger, for games she had never played. Together they built a language, not just of need but of soul. They carved into wood, drew in ash, painted with mud on stone. They shaped the world with hands and watched it respond. They laughed without sound. They argued without volume. They cried in silence, and it was loud enough. The child stayed. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. The seasons shifted again. The woman taught them how to fish, how to steep herbs for fever, how to tell stories using only hands and firelight. She showed them how to trace the stars, to feel the difference between pine and ash with closed eyes, to sing using movement instead of voice. The child taught her too. They brought a wildness the woman had forgotten. They danced barefoot in the rain, threw berries at the roof just to hear or feel the thump, collected feathers and named them. They carved tiny animals into bark and left them along the path like breadcrumbs. The forest grew more alive in their presence. Together they became a duet. Some nights they sat beside the fire, palms raised, fingers moving in long, slow conversations. They spoke of dreams, what flying might feel like, what the ocean might look like. They invented words for things that didn't exist yet. A spiral of fingers meant the ache in the heart when you missed something you never had. A tapping of knuckles meant the joy of catching a falling leaf before it hit the ground. Their language had no dictionary, but it was infinite. One winter evening, the woman noticed a crow perched on the edge of the mill's broken window. It did not move when she approached. It simply stared, then tilted its head and cawed. The child signed. What did it say? The woman signed back, I don't know. Then, with a smile, she added, but maybe it liked our story. And that's what their life became. A story told not in chapters, but in gestures. A tale written across fingers, in smoke trails, in carved wood and footprints by the river. The child grew taller. Their hair thickened. Their cheeks filled with health. Their movements became sharper, their hands more precise. They signed quickly now, thoughts spilling faster than fingers could keep up. The woman sometimes struggled to match the pace, but she smiled each time. She had once been alone in silence. Now silence danced beside her. They carved a book together, not one of paper but of bark slabs strung with twine. Each page held a symbol and beneath it a story. Some were memories, others were dreams. A few were just jokes only they understood. They placed the book on a stone shelf by the door, meant not for anyone else, but for themselves, to remember that they had made something out of nothing. One spring, travelers came. A woman and her son lost on the old road seeking shelter. The child met them by the river and led them to the mill. They shared bread, warmed their hands. They tried to speak, but the woman and child did not answer with sound. Instead, they answered with hands. The travelers didn't understand, but they listened, watched, smiled, and tried. That night by firelight, the child taught the stranger's son a sign for thank you. The boy repeated it, clumsy and proud. The woman watched from the shadows, her eyes reflecting flame. She felt something shift inside her, not pain, not pride, just purpose. Others came, not many. A man with a limp and a long silence of his own, a girl who hummed to herself but never spoke to others. A widow who had forgotten how to pray aloud. They came for warmth, for food, for quiet, and they stayed for the language. It spread slowly, not like wildfire, but like moss growing in corners, reaching where no one noticed. The symbols etched into wood appeared on walking sticks, on the sides of stones, on tree bark along old paths. The river knew their story now, and the wind carried it farther than feet could walk. The woman grew older. Lines softened her face. Her fingers ached in the cold. Her hair grayed like ash, but her hands still moved slowly, surely. She still carved, still taught, still watched the fire flicker and whispered stories to it with her palms. The child, now grown, built a shelter beside the mill. A new wheel turned with the current. A garden stretched along the bank. They wore a necklace of carved symbols and signed with grace. They were her echo, her answer. One morning they found the woman sitting by the river. Her eyes were closed, her hands rested in her lap. The water lapped gently at her feet. The air was cool with dawn. She did not wake. They did not cry, not in sound. They lit a fire and sat beside it. They carved her story into bark and tied it to the oldest tree. Then they taught the younger ones her name, not by saying it, but by shaping it with hands in the light of the flames. And so her story did not end. It flowed like the river, not in sound but in meaning.